Good evening. On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you to this session of JLF Words Are Bridges, now back with a new season. The second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in India has caused us enormous pain, suffering, and loss. We hope we can provide you all with some strength and succor with a series like JLF Words Are Bridges that celebrates the indomitable spirit, diversity and richness of Indian languages and international languages. We bring to you a plethora of original work, their translations, and an insight into each author's unique world. The series reinforces our vision to ensure the free flow of knowledge, information, and ideas during these troubled times. Ladies and gentlemen, we present today The Break of Dawn, Ali Khan Mahmudabad, in conversation with Saif Mahmood. Political scientist, academic and author, Ali Khan Mahmudabad's translation of Khan Mahboob Tarzi's Aghaaz-e-Sahr, or The Break of Dawn, is a tribute to a time when Indians across class, caste and creed came together to protect their homeland. Translated into English from the original Urdu, this thriller romance is based around the events of 1857. Ali Khan Mahmudabad's translation of this evocative text provides deep insight into our past and helps us context our present. Khan Mahboob Tarzi, who lived between 1910 and 1960, was a prolific author who wrote over 100 novels on history, politics, science fiction, romance, and erotica. Mahmudabad teaches history and political science at Ashoka University and writes a fortnightly column for the Urdu national daily Inqilab. In conversation with author, commentator, and lawyer Saif Mahmood, he discusses the process of translating this important work, which brings alive the true spirit of nationalism and the essence of belonging. Ali Khan Mahmudabad teaches history and political science at Ashoka University. He's a political scientist, historian, writer, columnist, and an occasional poet. He completed his MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge. He has travelled extensively in the Middle East and writes a fortnightly column for the Urdu national daily Inqilab. He also writes for a number of English language magazines and newspapers. Saif Mahmood writes on Urdu literature and is globally known for his passionate recitations of classical and modern Urdu poets alike. A critic, translator, and a rights activist, he's the author of the 2018 bestseller, Beloved Delhi, A Mughal City and Her Greatest Poets. An advocate of the Supreme Court of India, he holds a doctorate in comparative constitutional law in South Asia. His book on Urdu poet Majaz is awaited. We are delighted to welcome our wonderful speakers for today. And now let's begin our session, The Break of Dawn, Ali Khan Mahmudabad, in conversation with Saif Mahmood.
And thank you, Ali, for agreeing to be in conversation with us. After the whopping success of your last book on the history of the Mushaira, you are back again with one of the most awaited translations from Urdu into English of this year, Aghaaz-e-Sahr. This is the translation, The Break of Dawn, for our readers, and a fictional account of a romance between a young soldier of the army of the Raja of Mahmudabad during the 1857 First War of Independence and a young British girl who eventually turns into an informant. So, Ali, of course, the series is on translation, and we will talk about translations. But before that, may I ask you to tell our readers, why is it that you decided to translate? Of course, I've read your beautiful introduction, and you've given a personal reason also. But do tell our readers why you decided to translate a lesser-known book and a period novel at that.
So thank you, Saif Bhai. I don't know if there is anything apart from a personal reason. The author of this book was someone called Khan Mahboob Tarzi, who is a prolific Urdu writer, probably wrote more than 100 novels, and one of the first science fiction writers in Urdu, which I hope to next translate. Also
erotica.
He wrote, but under a pseudonym, and I'm afraid, according to today's standards of erotica, it's probably wouldn't even qualify. So he wrote under a pseudonym to earn money, right? To earn extra money. But this novel, I translated it because of a very personal reason. As you know, many of us in India are facing a situation around us where there's a kind of historical revisionism going on. There's a huge amount of uproar. There's a huge amount of political sort of movement around what history is Indian history, what is not Indian history, what it means to think about history in a nationalist lens. And part of that conversation, of course, hinges around the role of Muslims and India's Muslim pasts. And I use the word pasts in a plural because I don't think either Muslim is a category which is easily definable, and pasts, of course, there are multiple pasts to each particular event. So, when India's Muslim pasts are being interrogated, are being questioned, there's a larger consciousness about this. There's renaming, there's the purging from textbooks about various things, there's a rewriting of historical events. And as far as my own family is concerned, there was this figure who's a secondary character in the novel called Muqimud-Dawla, who was my 3 great-grandfather, who died fighting the British in 1857. And a few years ago, we, as a family, we had a matter which was somewhat in the public eye. And as a result, in Parliament, allegations were made about being traitors and somehow betraying India, and completely just twisted the history, right? So it's a very small attempt to set the record straight. Of course, it's a historical fiction, which is based on historical sources, which we'll talk about in terms of translation. So that is the reason that I thought, this was an opportunity to attempt, at least as far as coming generations is concerned, and record and bear witness to stories that are being erased or are being replaced. And 1857, a larger reason for translation, is that 1857, I think, is a remarkable moment in Indian history because most people from across the political spectrum found it to be and interpreted it to be a time when people from different communities and creeds came together, including Savarkar, right? Of course, he changes his views later on, but it's very interesting because when India was a young nation state, 1857 was seen to be one of those foundational moments. And I think today, young people in particular need to be reminded of that.
Yeah. So talking of historical fiction, I remember this 1820 or 1821 novel, Ivanhoe, Walter Scott. He begins with an apology to this fictional character where he says, he admits to a lack of historical accuracy in his work, which is a fictionalized account of history. But he says he defends his experiment as, he says, I can better translate the past for contemporary readers by doing this. And after 200 years, I think seems to be that we are still having the same conversation. But I have 2 questions related to this. And my first question is that in a period novel of this kind, how much role does literary license play, in making the periods of events accessible to contemporary readers? I'm not talking of your translation, in the original.
I think
and the second question that I have, which is a related question, maybe you could answer both together. And the second question that I have, which is a related question, is this not this, is it also not true of translation? I mean, if you are translating a period work, is it not more difficult to capture and translate the essence, the flavor of the times and of the language that is being used and the spirit of the work than just transposing it from one language to another?
So I think you're very right. I think that's both really wonderful questions. As we know, language, in a sense, the broadest meaning of language and vocabulary is what captures the life world of a community, of an individual. And in this sense, what Tarzi does, I think, is to some extent he does capture 1857. Of course, as a historian, I realized that there are many different perspectives. There's a caste angle, there's a class angle, there's a regional angle, and so on. So of course, this is not a history, but at the same time, since this book was written on the centenary of 1857 in 1957, India is 10 years old as a nation state by that point. Tarzi and his writing and the manner in the language in which he uses captures, in a sense, one aspect of a living tradition that spoke of a very vibrant and a very sort of powerful way which communities had developed to live together and live in harmony in a society which was predominantly religious, right? In fact, to this day, India is predominantly, I would say, largely religious. It hasn't gone through the kind of social changes that many other countries have, and even those are reverting now in Europe. So in that sense, it is difficult to capture that, and that's why, for instance, I've used footnotes, for example, the food stalls that were put up by various rajas for their armies, they were divided into barchi khanas and bhandaras. Now, of course, if you
Muslims and Hindus.
Muslims and Hindus, now it might seem anachronistic, but in a sense, it also spoke to a deep sensitivity that these people had about the importance of religious tradition and the fact that their way of living together emerged from being rooted and in a very deep sense of religion, right? So yes, I mean, in that sense, the Italian saying is very much true, that the translator is a traitor. Cannot but be a traitor. It's ironic because, of course, it was precisely being running away from accusations of being a traitor that I was translating this book in the first place.
Yes,
But I think, the novel captures, I think, the project of nation building. I think that's very important. I think as liberals, often sort of liberals, socialists, intellectuals, academics, they've traditionally scoffed at this idea of nationalism, right? It's a very sort of rough, very unrefined, it's for the masses. And therefore, unfortunately, across the world, particularly in India, nationalism and what it means and how it's defined has been left to people who have perhaps a more limited, myopic vision. So for me, what's very interesting also is that Tarzi is trying to contribute to this idea of an India and where people come together, irrespective of creed and community, and root it in a very real historical event in which this did happen.
Right. So what was the hardest part of the novel to capture while you were translating it?
So, Saif Bhai, the language is not difficult. It's a language that I'm familiar with. I was hoping that Tarzi would use more Awadhi for the people who are coming from the Qasbah, which he doesn't. He uses Urdu, but that also, in a sense, I understand, because it is very much a novel that is centered around upper caste characters. Not upper class necessarily, because of course he's a soldier in the army and so on. But it's an upper caste story, and in that sense, I suppose there was an unconscious, perhaps, or conscious attempt in Tarzi's mind to, that was his world which he was capturing in a certain sense. So there was not any particular part that was difficult in the sense of language, but as I said, earlier. The hard thing was to capture, aspects of vocabulary that are very embedded in South Asia, in Urdu in particular, in Hindustani, in the world that forms the universe of people living in Awadh, because that's where the novel is set. And so often, there would be, I would have questions about how, and then often the solution was to have a footnote, which I know is not normal, but Tarzi himself had footnotes in the original.
And you have translators' footnotes as well.
I've translated his footnotes.
In addition to Tarzi's footnotes. No, so now, do you mind reading out some extracts from the novel, from your translation, as well as the original, to give us a flavor of how you've translated it?
So basically, Alice Harrison has already become an informer. and Henry Lawrence has been sent to control the uprising, and they are now scheming about how to take over the residency, which is still there in Lucknow. Yes, replied Shiv Mangal. Sir Henry Lawrence has asked for reinforcements from Mandyaon, and those companies will be stationed in and around the residency and Machi Bhavan. Lawrence will take the white platoon, the artillery, and a company towards Chinhat in the morning. Shiv Mangal was in a hurry and left straight away, only to return after dusk. Riaz was sitting in the courtyard speaking to an Afridi Pathan from Malihabad when Mangal returned. Miss Baba was right on one count. The reinforcements from Mandyaon have arrived and Lawrence is preparing to leave for Chinhat. Will you go back to the residency now? Riaz asked Shiv Mangal. I will. Tell Miss Harris that tomorrow she should stay near the southern gate from morning to afternoon. Right, replied Shiv Mangal. I'll be off then. Riaz said his night prayers and fell asleep after eating. In the morning, he got up for the dawn prayers, and no sooner had he finished than Mustafa Khan arrived. His eyes were bloodshot and drowsy. Riaz said, looks like you didn't sleep all night. I haven't slept a wink since day before yesterday, and I just couldn't keep my eyes open, so I had a cup of tea. So I had a cup of tea. Have some cardamom and honey. That should get rid of the drowsiness. Mustafa Khan shouted to the servants to bring breakfast. Qaim Raza appeared and handing Riaz a piece of paper says, Miss Harris has sent this for you. Since he could read English, he opened the letter and his eyes gleamed with delight as he scanned it. Mustafa Khan and Qaim Raza peered over his shoulder. Alice has sent a map of the residency and has also given exact details of where Lawrence has stationed the guards.
That's beautiful. It's such an evocative translation, I must say. Also, it's proof you're not a traitor at all while translating. But you know, Ali, if you go 2 or 3 paragraphs down the same page, you have left some words like lathi and lutia, etc., in the original form. So how did you decide what to leave in the original and what to translate?
Well, I mean, you know, this was being published for a largely Indian audience. And I obviously, it couldn't become one of those academic tomes where you have reams of footnotes in every chapter.
Yes.
I thought some words which connote objects and some objects that might be not familiar, I would leave in. People, of course, now with the internet and so on, would be able to look up and study. My childhood is a very evocative.
आजकल तो डुबोई भी बहुत जा रही है.
लुटिया डुबोई भी जा
रही है. I remember, you know, we were celebrating Intizar Saab's first death anniversary, Intizar Hussain Saab's, and there was various translations, and in one of the translations, the word Nigodi had been left as it is on various pages. So I was in conversation with Jerry Pinto, and I asked him, I said, can you translate Nigodi? And Jerry, you know, like the Jerry he is, he said, I can't translate it, but I can act as a Nigodi and tell you. And then he went on to act as one and tell the audience what a Nigodi means. So sometimes you just have to leave it like that. You're right. So relating this, I just wanted to ask you, do you think, because your doctorate is in Mushaira and you've written that wonderful book, do you think the challenge of translating, especially translating the essence of the original to the language that you are translating it in, is a greater one in Urdu poetry than in prose? Because I've seen in various authoritative texts, say even shares of, you know, couplets of Mir Ghalib or Mir, 2 lines have been translated into 8. Does this kind of doubling, you know, the original size or increasing the original size not take a toll on the semantics or the aesthetics of the original?
So, I mean, prose in that sense is easier. Poetry, I think, frankly, I think it's impossible, except when someone is so deeply steeped in both languages, not just in Urdu, that you understand, जिसको उर्दू में कहेंगे ज़बान का मिजाज समझना.
मिजाज.
I suppose the temperament.
अब ज़बान का मिजाज समझना की भी कोई सही अंग्रेजी मतलब appropriate नहीं हो सकती. You can't really translate
to say
ज़बान का मिजाज.
The temperament of a language, then it would be a very mealy mouth.
Yes.
Mealy mouth.
Yes.
No, so you know, yes, my PhD was on, well, half of it was actually on Mushaira. The other half was actually also on the question of belonging, of patriotism.
Yes. Yes.
And so how those two are linked. And in a sense, I suppose this book is also about belonging. So someone wants to have a psychoanalytical go at me, then I suppose interesting. But I mean, like, we are shaped by that which unfolds around us.
Yeah.
But no, I think, you know, poetry is difficult. Poetry, in a sense, I mean, you know, I've said this to you before, and people have also got offended before. I mean, you know, I know Shahid Ali and other younger people now are doing this, writing ghazals in English. Frankly, I think it's impossible, because whether it's a ghazal in Turkish, in Persian, in Arabic, in Urdu, they all work off a common vocabulary that has an embedded genealogy, a sense of genealogy, embedded memories, embedded wisdom. And as soon as you replace, that with an English translation, then a word will no longer help you to, or make you think of Hafiz or Sadi or Ghalib or Mir or Rumi or Umar al-Khayyam or X number of poets who have also used the same word. So I think, you know, there are limits to a language, right? And you know, there's that often, you know, it's all these things become memes. Wittgenstein's famous quote about the limits of language representing the limits of our world, and I think that's very much true. And in a sense, Urdu is going through fundamental transformations. The Urdu that is in this book is very simple. I mean, this is not high literature. I was thinking what my aunts and my uncles would make of this book. It's a sort of airport read, if you like. Someone asked me the other day, it was Tarzi the kind of Chetan Bhagat? I said, certainly not, and the Chetan Bhagat of his time. But, you know, Tarzi was one of these people who was paid by publishers to churn out book after book after book. You know, they were writing books and novels in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, it's incredible. Ibn Safi also was writing, you know, books, detective novels and so on. So, you know, prose is easier, poetry is harder. And I think to enter the world of someone, you have to be able to really speak their language. And I think the biggest problem in socially, politically, culturally that we're facing today is partly to do with this idea that, you know, we have assumed that the desacralization of the world is the only thing that will lead to secularization. You know, there is no concept of the sacred and the profane anymore. It is all profane. And because, and here you have a novel that values not just the sacred in the metaphysical sense of his own community and his own world, but also that of the other. You know, so for instance, and this again is borne out by historical events. I mean, as far as my personal reason for translating this, that very ancestor of mine, Muqimud-Dawla Nawab Ali Khan, he became blood brothers with the Raja of Ramnagar Dhameri, Guru Baksh Singh Ji.
Yes.
And it's
yes.
Who's and what was amazing?
Yes, you found them on your Instagram page. I read. Well, you found them on your Instagram page.
I had heard this story since I was a child, that the Rajas of Ramnagar Dhameri were Hindu Rajas, were our blood brothers, and in the old days, 2 generations earlier, you know, elephants would go and come in weddings and so on and so forth. So, you know, it actually meant something. And then I posted 2 years ago about this book. I posted on Instagram, as we tend to share snippets of our lives these days. And this young lady who I didn't know, wrote saying, I have heard the same story from my family, and she was a descendant of the Raja of Ramnagar Dhameri. So, you know, and then we reconnected. So that was quite a sort of exciting moment for me, because stories, you know, the stories we are told make us who we are. And here was someone who had been told the same story. So it's, in a sense,
the same story. Yes. Yeah. Let me ask you this. I read your note on the translation very carefully. And so it ends with, you've ended with saying that words undergo, and I'm reading your note, words undergo transformations of meanings, new vocabularies are created, and indeed, with the rise of technology, the very grammar and syntax of language change. Therefore, novels such as Aghaaz-e-Sahr become even more important, as they provide a snapshot of the time and place in which they were written and the audiences for whom they were intended. Now, from this, I want to ask you a very important, very crucial question, which has been bothering me as a translator also. Now, when this novel, for instance, when this novel was written, or the period this novel relates to, the language used was the language which was contemporary then, but may have now become archaic. So when you translate such a work, do you use an English equivalent of an English archaic word, or do you use contemporary English words to make it more accessible to the contemporary reader? And I'll give you an example. I was reading a translation of Fez, and somebody has translated, a professor has translated, "वो लोग बहुत खुशकिस्मत थे जो इश्क को काम समझते थे," as those guys who are really lucky who considered loving an occupation. So I asked her, I said, did Fez say those guys? And she said, I'm just trying to make it more accessible to the contemporary reader.
No, it's interesting you asked that question. When I was translating the speech of characters, even the portion that I read out, this Shiv Mangal says, "I'll be off then," right? Colloquialism in English that is slightly old, right? It's not, it is used, but someone who's learnt English as a second language perhaps would not use it. So I did try and use phrases, vocabulary that was not alien to a new reader, but through English could capture also, and in other places, disparaging, so I translate, allusions to the English as whiteys, because, this was also, we Firangs and so on. Somewhere I've left in Firangs, in other places where they're used to the Goras, they're whiteys, so that whiteys. It's kind of, it's derogatory in the way in which the characters mean it. So I think, I didn't try and write it in a sense for a new audience. In fact, to be honest, I didn't think of an audience except that I wanted young people to read it. So I wanted to make it accessible. That was the only thing. And anyway, Urdu is accessible. Yeah, sorry.
So do you agree that a translation should itself read like a good work in the language in which or of which it is translated into?
Yes, it's fundamentally a disservice unless that happens. In a way, I wouldn't claim it for my own work, but the great works of translation are often great works of art in themselves. Translating Umberto Eco or Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, the people who translate these works are masters of the language themselves. They're not mere translators. In fact, I would say that they have a station often which is much higher. And translation, unfortunately, and translators don't get the respect that they do. People who do it full time and so on, because they are actually, it's amazing. They're crafting. They're working with the constraints already imposed by one language and crafting an entirely new world while keeping in those mind those constraints.
Yeah, and perhaps it's truer of translating from English into Urdu because they're also completely different cultures.
I think so. But Urdu, in South Asia, at least Urdu has maybe it's not as popular, of course, as it was in the 60s and 50s, but there are echoes that remain alive. And I think it has a strange, Urdu is at home nowhere and everywhere. So it has a strange kind of afterlife where it evokes an intimacy in people that don't even speak the language.
Yes.
It's one of those strange, it's really strange. We are used to it, so we perhaps don't pay attention. But if you think about it, Urdu has an ability to draw in people, despite people not understanding the entire sentence. There are very few other languages. I would say Persian is a very florid, very highly sophisticated language, Arabic also, but it doesn't have the same effect. And I think it's to do with this particular part of the world. And, the openness, the confluence, the kind of coming together of cultures that gave rise to Urdu. Urdu was the result of confluence, and unfortunately, we're living now in a world where we are seeking to, discern authentic from not authentic, and divide the streams back into separate courses, and not bring them together. I mean, for me, the language. I think the art that Laboni has done for this work, Laboni wrote. That really captures this in a sense.
I was going to come to that, actually. That was my next question about the art. It's beautiful, and one must also read her note on the illustrations. And and I fully agree with her when she says that it offers several more layers for you to dip into as you are transported to Lucknow from a very different time, and that's the whole purpose of the illustrations. But let me ask you one last question on translation, on your experience as a translator, and which is, how do you mitigate while translating something from say two different culture, from one culture into another? How do you mitigate the risk of rewriting it? Because at the end of the day, that's not what you're supposed to do.
Well, I don't think one has to be honest about not letting one's own sense of ego be transposed onto the book, and therefore you are interpreting to some extent, but not to the extent where you're trying to interpret an entire novel and then produce that. So you have to remain faithful to the form, to the sentences, to the characters, to the story. I think it's within the sentence that you have some leeway to allow your own mind to to affect the text a little bit. But overall, the larger structure of the book remains the same. And as a translator, you have to do that. Otherwise, of course, it's not a translation, it's an interpretation or something else.
Yes. So do you also see yourself in the future as a translator from Urdu or from English into Urdu?
I'm not sure, Saif Bhai, because as you know, I write a column in Urdu. It's the only regular gig I have. For 11 years, I've been writing it. I think there are sometimes, when I'm writing those columns, and I do use concepts, terms, vocabulary that comes, let's say, from the academy or from political philosophy or so on, and I do translate, and it's very interesting, to do that. I mean, I wouldn't fancy myself as a translator, because that would be, would be very presumptuous of me to say so, because there are people who do this as a form of art and as a form of a very serious work. So I'm not sure if I do that. As you know, I often joke that ज़्यादातर लोग एक दूसरे को टोपी पहनाते हैं, मैं खुद को टोपी पहनाता हूँ. तो ये भी अब एक टोपी पहन ली है मुतरजिम होने की, to be a translator. I've sort of.
आप सोचते किस ज़बान में?
ये मुनहसिर है इस बात पर कि सियाक़ व सबाक़ क्या है, what the context is. I dream in Urdu, in Awadhi, in English. Very occasionally, when I was living in Damascus in Syria, I began to dream in Arabic. And sometimes that comes back. Farsi also. So it's
सवाल ये कि उनमें से किन ख्वाबों की ताबीर हो चुकी है और किन की होना बाकी.
ये तो फिर देख, ये तो इसके लिए दूसरा सेशन करना पड़ेगा.
Okay, let me ask you my last question, and because we are, I think, also running out of time. So I was surprised actually to find from your introduction that Khan Mahmudabad Tarzi was one of the first science fiction writers in Urdu, and that he also wrote detective novels and political novels and erotica, as you said, under a pseudonym to earn extra money. I think more of his work deserves to be translated, and you've just mentioned in the beginning of the session that you intend to translate some science fiction. Would you not intend to translate more of his work? He's got a colossal amount of work that is lying in libraries. In fact, even this book, I believe you found with great difficulty the original of this, the book that you've translated, Aghaaz-e-Sahr. तो ऐसा कोई इरादा है आपका that you are going to translate more of his works बाकायदा?
Well, I mean,
as a series or something.
I would like to, because I do feel that it's a disservice to Tarzi. That he's not a known. He was prolific, had a very difficult life. Maybe a science fiction. In fact, I was thinking the other day. I give the names of a lot of his novels, just in case someone else who's reading this wants to translate. And on page 25 of the introduction, I've given a list in the footnotes of the various genres of novels that he has. And one of the ones that struck me, which I haven't got my hands on, is Ek Jaan Teen Qalib, which is a science fiction novel. Now, the reason it really provoked my interest is because I don't know if you're familiar with Chinese science fiction, but there's a very important work that has emerged that is now being made into a major film, and it's called The Three Body Problem. And obviously it's going to be very different from what Tarzi wrote, but just the title, Ek Jaan Teen Qalib.
Yes.
I mean, it struck me that what if Tarzi was onto something that is now becoming so I will, I think, try and translate slowly one of his other books, because I do think people like him should be read. And at the end of the day, I don't know if you felt this, but it's a kind of swashbuckling, fast-paced adventure. It's not a difficult read.
It is. Yes, it is.
It's not pretending to be high literature. It's not pretending to be sophisticated. It's a good old-fashioned romance. And we all need that.
Yes. No, certainly these kind of books deserve to be translated more, because, of course, also on 1857 we have a lot of translations of historical accounts, but translations of historical fiction are far and few. So thank you very much for translating this, and we look forward to many more translations from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ali Khan Mahmudabad. It has been an absolute honor and pleasure for us to have you here and to hear you speak. Saif Mahmood, thank you for your excellent anchoring and moderation. And thank you both for the insights that you gave us into the art and craft of translation. And as always, thank you all for being a great and appreciative audience. As you're all aware, the great repercussions of COVID-19 have set us back in ways that we could have never have imagined. In our efforts to help recover from the devastating impact suffered by the arts, Teamwork Arts launched Art Matters in 2020, through which we have been working towards creating awareness about the current reality of artists across India affected by the pandemic, and we are developing support channels for them. Our efforts have helped raise over 7.5 million, and over the past year, we, in collaboration with our partner NGOs, were able to help over 5,200 artists and craftspeople in need across the country. With the onset of this vicious second wave, artists and artisans across the country again face unprecedented and heartbreaking challenges. We have launched an emergency fund to provide them with a range of resources from food, rations to healthcare and medicines. You can contribute by pressing the contribute button on your screen and help their cause. On behalf of us all, stay safe, stay double masked, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday on the 10th of June for our next session. Good night, stay safe.